The parents of the 1950s were, I think, the most unusual generation of the 20th century. These are the people who had grown up in the Depression. They had experienced real tough times when they were children and when they were teenagers. And then World War II hit, as many of them were just reaching adulthood, and they had the trauma of the war. And then, after all that, they reached the 1950s at a time when the U.S. was tremendously prosperous, when the economy was booming as we've never seen it before. And I think they reacted to that prosperity, and I think they reacted strongly to all of the trauma of the Depression and the war by turning inward a bit, by marrying young, by emphasizing home and family, as if that was something they couldn't get back in the 30s and 40s and now valued all the more.
And this is Levittown. Here you can own your own home, complete with its own refrigerator, television set, and clothes dryer. You can raise your children far from the city's dirt, crowding, and crime, in comfort and safety.
Growing up in the suburbs, nearly 70% of white middle-class baby boomers spent their childhoods in these totally new communities. For these young people and their older brothers and sisters, this environment would have an enormous impact on how they would behave in the 60s.
Don't play with the food. When I was your age, we didn't have food.
The children, however, of this generation that brought the world out of the third world saw this injustice. They grew up in the comfort and had little understanding of the squalor their parents were rescued from. The wars and international interference post-World War II were no longer the moral rescuing from tyranny, but had returned to wars for financial gain, both for resources and for economic benefit, of the now out-of-control military-industrial complex. These children created a new left. Since economic prosperity was now less of an issue for white Americans, they forgot the importance of the unions their parents fought to create. They chose to focus on the military, mostly out of self-survival, since there was a draft that would send them against their will to fight in wars they disagreed with, and rightfully so. A more educated generation, they were less materialistic than their parents. Materialism and homogeneity were to them constrictive and shallow.
Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for.
Because of their profoundly different life experiences, kids had trouble understanding why their fathers worked so hard. The way many of them saw it, their fathers were engaging in the single-minded pursuit of material comforts.
Their parents' generation was largely proletarian, with an aversion to bohemianism, sophistication, and culture. It used authoritarianism, conformity, social norms, religiosity, and fear of communism to preserve their new post-war utopia. Working class and simplicity became their identity.
They saw women as feeling very discontented. They saw husbands feel pressured, harried by the demands of their jobs and families, and they saw children as feeling extremely alienated. So clearly, I think many of the roots of the 60s explosions were planted in the supposedly placid family of the 1950s.
The rules were things you talked about on the telephone with your friends, and they were imposed by your parents. Parents talked about it a lot. There were high school counselors who told you what the rules were, and even if they weren't written down, everybody really knew, and you could almost read them out, cite them. And I think looking back on it from the 60s, what people did in the 60s was self-consciously break every damn one of them.
What were the rules? One of them was obey authority. Don't ask questions. In the 60s, millions of young people would renounce that one.
If you misbehaved, you weren't normal. And the idea of normal is a kind of vegetative state where nothing happens. But that's what everybody tried to aspire to. But I think it's a word that people are constantly using to exhort you to behave better. Why don't you be normal? It's not normal to wear your hair long. It's not normal to wear Levi's. It's not normal to listen to rock and roll. It's not normal to read comic books. There's a whole list of a million things that everybody does that isn't normal.
Another rule: fit in with the group. Don't stand out. Conform in your actions and your appearance. In the 60s, great numbers of young people would, quote, do their own thing. Many young people found these restrictions painfully repressive, but they struggled to obey them anyhow, because if they didn't, they knew there'd be unpleasant consequences from society or from their peers.
They could have sought a more well-balanced existence. Like many parts of Europe, they could have been workers by day and bohemians by night. They could have laid brick by day and read or discussed Dostoevsky by night. Instead, they became satisfied with only economic progress and rejected or overlooked social progress, making the parents economically progressive but socially conservative. The children, on the other hand, were economically indifferent and socially progressive. The children, growing up with African-American music heroes and the world's first youth music and culture they provided, viewed the African-American existence and plight not out of sight or out of mind. They joined the black community in its fight for equality and were met with resistance from the parents' generation, especially in rural areas, but also even in the halls of Berkeley.
But now something came along that was much harder to stop. Something that millions of young people would seize and use as a means to further separate themselves from adult society.
Flying on the beam, set on flight control, radio to rock and roll.
The arrival of rock and roll in my life was like something that came from another planet. We hadn't heard anything like that sound before. We hadn't heard people making that kind of noise, breaking all limits of politeness.
Well, long tall fallacies, build a species guide, everything that Uncle John need, oh baby, yeah, baby.
But many, many parents and many children were scared of the words, the style, and the racial implications of black music.
The rebellion for me against all of the conventions that seem to make life so stifling, and rock and roll along with the beatnik movement, along with Kerouac and Ginsberg and things like that, it really it helped to punch a hole in the 50s conformity.
Despite a lengthy struggle, the millions of black Americans still did not share in the nation's prosperity or enjoy the full rights of their citizenship. In 1964, many expected that such inequities would soon be addressed.
We thought that essentially the material problems of the world had been solved, and that the important thing now is to solve the moral problems.
There was a society that had to be changed, and it was not going to be changed unless some people decided that they would dedicate their lives to changing it. It was not going to change spontaneously.
In the mid-1960s, the determination to challenge traditional boundaries seemed to be growing in almost every arena. Perhaps most striking was a broadening struggle for civil rights, a struggle that many whites now joined in large numbers. And the movement expanded to other causes at the end of the so-called Freedom Summer.
The First Amendment didn't apply to any campuses in the country. You couldn't give a speech without getting it cleared by the administration.
When Freedom Summer veterans at the University of California at Berkeley tried to recruit others to their cause, they were barred by university regents.
It just set off this explosion among the students, and people who had never had a political thought in their head just got fired by the idea that someone couldn't tell them when and where to say what they wanted to say.
You don't stand up for your freedom now, you're dead, guys.
United by what they saw as an injustice, thousands of students began a series of protests that lasted 8 weeks. When college officials threatened to expel several of the student leaders, the conflict reached a boiling point.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
You have to put your body on the wheels, and we're going to go in there, and we're going to take over this building. And so when the crowd began to move, I just went with it.
The first floor is filled, the second floor is filled, and we are...
Some people looked a little scared because they'd never done anything like that before. I was scared.
I think we're telling you this makes us pissed off and we're sick and tired.
When the student takeover of a campus building resulted in more than 800 arrests, the university faculty finally weighed in on the side of the demonstrators. Cornered as they were, the regents granted free speech to the students. And thus began an era of confrontation at American universities.
Schism formed between the generations. One championed a dignified living standard, but had the oversight of that living standard being for all people, and the oversight of living only a life of materialistic comfort with little to no regard for culture, the arts, philosophy, and further social progress. The other championed the rights of minorities to have the same living standard and championed against a militaristic policy based on financial gain. They had the oversight to understand that some of what their parents stood for, that middle-class existence, was a firewall against the tyranny of the past, the free market, and the dismantling of democracy by oligarchs. There were now two lefts in America, one of identity politics for the disenfranchised demographics like minorities and women, whom both lived like second-class citizens still. These were righteous causes, but they paid little attention to the working class. Other countries had parliamentary systems that had many parties for many interests. America had, and still has, only two. One a business party right, and the other a working class party left. It should have been a united left that followed the principles of Martin Luther King, who encompassed facets of both generations, standing for unions and a living wage, and opposing war, and fighting for the rights of minorities, was now a factionalized one with little understanding or agreement between the two. One was now an aging working class left that was slowly being dismantled. The oligarchs were on the rise again. Many of the children of the oligarchs of old took up their parents' mantle and began to restore the third world status of America.